And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David Nolen. Thanks, David.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a while since I've been here, but I'm excited to be back. I remember when the Clojure meetups were quite small, and one time there was like 5 people there, and like Rich Hickey was the only guy. Like it was like Rich Hickey and like Eric Thorsten and like Stuart Sierra and like 2 other people. That was it. And I was like, it's grown quite a bit. So before I actually start, I do want to talk about something like just real quick pitch. I don't know how many people know, but I live in Brooklyn and I have a studio in Brooklyn. And if some of you might be remote developers doing Clojure stuff, you should come check out our space. I don't know if people are looking for a place to work, but I'll get into that. But before we start, I just want to talk about a workshop that I'm running. Some of you may have seen this on the mailing list, but I want to describe some of the details. So one thing that I do at this studio, besides hack on Clojure Script all the time, is there's an interesting group of technologists there. It's kind of like a creative space, a collaborative space. I've been in the studio for like 12 years, and it's an interesting cast of characters. People that have been there have they've gone off to work at Google Creative Labs, or gone off to work at Twitter, or gone off to work for gaming companies in China building games with Lisp and Unity, all kinds of stuff. It's cool. It's like always an interesting set of people. But if you're looking for a desk, that's cool. But another thing we've started doing recently is this thing called AI Atelier. So if you're a fan of Lisp, you know that artificial intelligence, sprung originally from John McCarthy's, brain as like a thing to do, as far as that term. But now with the interest in deep learning, I was never a person that really cared that much, but the deep learning stuff has got me excited. Me and my friend Kovas Bogota, who is at Twitter doing deep learning analysis on Twitter's content, as well as Evan Casey, who's using reinforcement learning to basically train robots to do more interesting behaviors. We're running a class next month, June 16th and 17th. We'll be running this periodically for software engineers who, maybe you tried to do a MOOC, but you're like, do MOOCs kind of suck because you never finish and you don't really learn that much. So we do a hands-on workshop for people interested. It's typical training rates, and hopefully your company's excited about you picking up a new skill. So come check it out. But just to say a bit more about it, I was not interested in machine learning because, for me, I was like, okay, it's like, statistical analysis, but you can't do very interesting tasks yet. And for me, that really dramatically changed. As some of you know, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm an avid Go player. And for me, when I saw the AlphaGo original tournament against ESID, I was like, okay, finally, there's something less trivial that they're using this for. So I thought something that I should get into. And so that's kind of why we're launching this series, because I believe that it's will eventually become a meaningful software engineering skill for anybody, not just for researchers. It's and what's really cool about this stuff is that it's really gone from being like esoteric research stuff to being really practical. If you're not fans of Go, when Google published their paper, AlphaZero, which described how they changed the original AlphaGo algorithm to make a version of AlphaGo that could learn the game from zero knowledge, no previous knowledge, no domain knowledge about the game. They trained it from playing random moves using reinforcement learning. They surpassed all previous versions. So they went from being a very complicated system to be a system that's exceedingly simple, does very little, and recovers, basically 3,000 years of Go theory, and then, surpasses it by quite a bit. It's much stronger than human pros now. And now human pros go to look at AlphaGo games, AlphaZero games for inspiration. This paper came out a year ago now, I think. And already there's an open source version. There's an open source version called Lila Zero that is now already professional strength. So it's gone from being like, okay, you need to be researched to care about this stuff. Google publishes a paper. 1 year later, just a typical engineer can read it, understand it, and implement that system. And it requires you don't have to be an AI researcher. And I think this is very much something that's going to impact us as engineers in a big way. So we're designing a workshop series around that. Lots of cool stuff. If you haven't seen this, go check it out. Google posted this thing called the AlphaGo teaching tool where humans can go see what AlphaGo thinks are the best moves, and this has a massive impact. All the pros in China, Korea, and Japan. They've now changed their opening based off of AlphaGo's analysis. Again, this is the Leela Zero strength graph. So Leela Zero is the open source version of Alpha Zero, and it's an amazing result. Again, going directly from papers to something that reproduces the same result. But there's a lot of stuff. I don't know how many people follow the deep learning stuff. Another thing that I think is like really great is lots of domains where I think I personally wouldn't have thought that's a great use case for deep learning. This is a paper called Pix to Code, where somebody figured out a way to go from an image to code. And then this paper came out, I don't know, a couple years ago, and then somebody decided, I'm going to take an image and I'm going to generate HTML and CSS. And they were able to accomplish this after a couple of months of work by reading a paper. As you know, I like reading papers because I think they're actually are very practical. This is really awesome. So from an image, you can now generate semantically correct HTML and CSS through deep learning. And then Google just came out, like, I don't know, maybe it was 4 or 5 months ago, maybe it was 6 months ago, but they came out with a paper called The Case for Learned Index Structures, where they did some experiments showing that there's a very close similarity between a trained network and index structures, data structures, and that data structures are generic data structures. You're trying to get optimal performance, but you can take a neural network and train it, and you can get, you can surpass the performance of generic data structures because the network understands more about actual data patterns than a generic data structure ever could. So they're positing that in the future, we won't even write data structures. We'll just train models, and the models will be our data structures. So again, huge impact on software engineering as a discipline. So anyways, that's the spiel. Come check it out if you're interested. I'm doing this workshop. Come see the space. If you come, it's really cool. And if you're a remote developer and want a cool place to work, talk to us. These are just some photos from the workshop. It's really fun. It's small. It's very hands-on. We don't do brain dumps. We're currently focusing on TensorFlow and Google's Colab, which is a fork of Jupyter. But it's really nice because there's no setup. But it's really great. We did 2 days. We covered all the basics plus convolutional neural nets. Anyways, if you want to get more details, check out this URL, aiatelier.com. And if you have questions, feel free to come ask me later. So enough of the spiel. Let's talk about embracing simpler tools. So, it's funny because I was like checking, because I haven't been to the Clojure NYC meetup in so long. I was like, I hope nobody talked about this, and I'm going to try to make it a little bit different. And I saw that nobody talked about tools depths. I think it's new enough. In fact, raise your hand if you use it. So not that many. Raise your hand if you've heard of it, though, tools depths. Okay, good. So everybody's heard of it, but very few people are using it. So this talk is definitely coming from somebody who's been involved in Clojure since, using it in some way or shape or form since 2008. So almost 10 years and a couple months. And I think it's really not something to be seen as something to replace what's come before, but I think something that can really augment and simplify how we use Clojure when we're building systems. Because for me, my experience has been, and we'll get into it, that the existing set of tools often bring a lot of complexity, and they don't necessarily pay their way. But I believe tools depth gives an incremental path towards a simpler tool chain for Clojure. So this is the Wayback Machine. This is the Clojure website from 2008 when I encountered it. I was taking 3 months off from work, and I was like, I'd read SICP in 2003, and I was like, Lisp is really cool, but can't get a job doing Lisp. I was living in Texas. And then when I moved here, in 2008, I had some months off, and I was like, I tried to get Common Lisp working, and it was really a pain in the butt. It wasn't, Quick Lisp didn't exist. And I found Clojure. And I was really hyped about Lisp because, Paul Graham was talking about Hacker News. And I was like, well, I've been doing Java for a while now. Clojure lets me do, a version of Lisp that I can recognize based off my experience with Scheme. And it's really easy to set up, and it interacts with all the Java libraries that I'm familiar with. In fact, this is the old Getting Started page. This is the thing that convinced me to use it, which is up here. It's a bit small, but you can see Quick Start. After you download the zip and double-click and expand the jar, the Quick Start is Java CP Clojure jar, and you launch the REPL. And so this, I was getting started in basically 30 seconds. It's time to download the zip. Whereas my experience with Common Lisp was, 2 weeks later I had something working. It's not the same. It's not true anymore, but that's just what happened before. So this, the thing that people were using back then is Swain Closure. Raise your hand if you use Swain Closure. So very small list of hands. So this meant you were around in the early days. So in the early days, the tooling story was basically Emacs. Swain Closure was the thing to use. Now, Swain Closure was an integration for Clojure for Slime, which was the superior Lisp interaction mode for Emacs. And it's amazing. It is actually a superior Lisp interaction mode. It's the closest thing to like being in something like a Smalltalk environment without launching a Smalltalk VM. Slime is amazing. Swain Closure allowed you to use the Slime protocol to get things like all this stuff that people are talking about today, like it's cool. It worked in 2009. That includes, decompiling the bytecode, jumping to the Java methods, getting a step debugger, macro expanding, inline. All that stuff worked because all that code had been written before in Slime. You just need to make Swain Closure do the closure bits for the language. So actually, the tooling was pretty good as long as you could swallow the Emacs pill. At that time in 2009, there really wasn't that much. There wasn't that much to use though, because in the end, you were probably a Java programmer wanting to. You were sick of Java 1.5, 1.6 because nothing was going on with the language, and it was really not feeling good. And you're like, I want to include Clojure in my stack. And then what were you going to use? Or you want to start a new project? And the truth was at the time, really Maven was the only answer. In some sense, I kind of fell into the same trap that a lot of people fell into, which was that like XML sucks. I'm never going to use Maven, which was not actually was a kind of a rash decision. But I remember seeing Stuart Sierra. This is Stuart Sierra's post from 2009. Maven's not so bad. And of course, everybody was like, "What's wrong with you? It's not true. Maven sucks." But we'll come back to that. Maven is not so good, but still, it might be better in some ways. Leiningen development started in 2010 because, again, there was a huge hole. Like you either had to use Ivy or Maven to do Clojure work. And it really felt incongruent, right? You had this really simple language that had all this power, but the moment you wanted to do anything non-trivial like build a project, you had to take on the entire complexity of the Java ecosystem, and just didn't feel that good. So Phil Hagelberg, who really was coming from the Ruby community, but was excited about Clojure. I mean, Leiningen, in some sense, was the reason that Clojure took off in the early days, because people wanted to try something and they wanted to be able to start doing simple projects, maybe not huge projects, but simple projects in a way that felt idiomatic. And Leiningen definitely delivered this. I mean, I remember Leiningen from the earliest versions. In the early days, Leiningen wasn't that different from Tools Deps. There were no plugins. It just managed your deps. You had access to all the Maven classifier stuff. It was just, you don't have to write XML. Def project was very much like a POM file. You list your dependencies. And that was, I think, the sweet spot. Of course, since that time, I mean, there's so many plugins. There's a really rich ecosystem. The plugins are great. But now what's happened is that Leiningen went from being something simple to basically Leiningen does everything. It literally does everything, from managing your dependencies to deploying your artifact. It does the whole chain. And now with all the integration with Clojure Script, I mean, it manages your assets, fingerprinting, all this stuff. It does, I would say, too much. People have really tried to pack too much functionality into it. Then there's boot. And again, there's nothing wrong with Leiningen. I'm just explaining the narrative, the story, the history of all this stuff. There's boot. Boot was, there's things that are harder to do in Leiningen because Leiningen is declarative in a certain sense, but people basically have to work around the fact that it's a bit declarative. So boot came out with a thing that said it's important to have a build tool that's flexible. So boot isn't declarative. Boot lets you write programs. But of course, the problem with boot, and the reason that boot hasn't taken off that much, I think, outside of people that are really into it, is that boot makes tooling really hard, right? So raise your hand if you use Cursive. Raise your hand if you use Emacs. So that's basically, I would say that's looks like 70%, just eyeballing it. So, you really depend on your tools to understand that file format. Leiningen is at least declarative in some sense on the surface. And of course, XML files are completely inert. They're easy to analyze. But boot, really, you're like doing everything, dependency management, building your project, everything is a Clojure program. And there are a lot of macros, and it does a lot of stuff. So there's a real downside because in some sense, people still write boot plugins. It does a lot of stuff. people wanted to do a lot of stuff. So I'm trying to tell you, stop trying to do lots of stuff. Like, it's not a good idea. And this has come through not just because I'm an opinionated programmer. I am, sure, I use lists. I must be opinionated, but this is coming from direct experience. So 4 years ago, I started working for Cognitect, and we work on lots of interesting client projects where we see the craziest project files you've ever seen, like the craziest project files, right? These are project files that are 600 to 1,000 lines. There's profiles. Nobody really knows how anything works. Everybody's afraid to change it. Some mess of plugins. And some things that run in tests, some things that run in this other profile. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So, everybody starts building tools with good intentions, right? But of course, you want your tools to be used by people, and people have different needs, and you make compromises. And what happens is that over time, maybe the tool does more than you ever thought it should. But more importantly, what happens is that people make it do things you never thought it was really good for, right? That you can't really do anything about that. You put your thing out in the world, and people wanted to do things that are really outside the scope. It's an open source project, so what can you do? So what happened was that after a couple of years of this at Cognitect, I was like, I'm done. I'm not using Boot. I'm not using Maven. In fact, internally, people were like assessing Boot, and I was like, nope, I'm not doing it. Like, just didn't do it. All I used when on my own projects, if I had any control, was we're only using Maven and Bash. That's the only thing I ever used. Even in my open source project, if you followed it very closely, I always maintained my own POM file and a Bash script. And my experience was that if something went wrong in Boot or Leiningen, finding the answer was nearly impossible, or I had to really ask the original developers. Or if something went wrong with Maven, finding the answer was writing the error into Google, and it'd be a Stack Overflow thing, right? I could always find the answer because enough people used it, and I didn't want to lose a day working on build bugs, right? This is not what I want to do. Like, I'd rather write meaningful code. So that's why I stopped using that stuff. Again, it's like, you have these beautiful plans. It's going to be great. And you expect people are going to use a certain way. People are going to walk down the street. They're going to follow the signs. They're going to follow the rules. But that's not what software architecture looks like, right? Yeah, maybe there's some streets, but maybe people are setting up markets on those streets. Maybe cars are parked where they're not supposed to be parked. Buses are going where they're not supposed to be going. People are selling things where they have no license. That's software, right? Real systems are like, you tried to do a thing, and over time, it's very different from what you expected. And actually, that's not a bad thing. Like, sometimes people think, oh, that's terrible. But no, that's just what software development is. You have to sort of accept it and then think, well, what can we do to alleviate it? We can't control everything, but perhaps by starting afresh or starting from a simpler base, maybe we can have something that develops more simply over time and doesn't quickly get to this state. How quickly you get to the thing is this problem is, I think, something we don't think enough about. And for me, my background is in UI development, so I'm very interested in feedback loops. And so for me, like, I'm sort of describing my feedback loop with this stuff. But, as people know, I'm very interested in, like, what's the end experience for Clojure Script users? Because that's my user base. I'm the lead developer of Clojure Script, so I'm constantly getting on Slack or the mailing list and being like, what's not working for you? The most important question that I care about is what's not working for you. And it doesn't matter if you're a beginner or you've been doing this for as many years as I have, right? I meet experts. Like, there are people at Cognitect who are like, David, I don't know how to use Clojure Script, right? That means something's wrong. That means something is too hard. And that there's a lot of things there, right? That could be things in Clojure Script itself. It could be in the way that the build plugins work, so on and so forth. And eventually, if you're lucky, you have the time to go and really think about the problem and address it. And I'll talk about how I specifically addressed it. I just threw this in there because of feedback loops are important. Because, for me, like, I threw in this slide because it's like, no, software practices like this. I feel like Pavlov's dog, right? Like, these are like the thought leaders that tell you something is good or bad. And then you just like subject yourself to this training. And then it takes so long to get yourself out. So I'm trying to convince you, take a step back. Maybe you've sort of, jumped on a train and actually you realize it's time to get off. Or augment and have a gradual iterative path off. So I already did the Maven spiel. So if you haven't looked at Depth CLI, I highly recommend it. Please look at it. The thing that's really cool about Depth CLI is something that internally at Cognitech, we've tried to come up with things like this, but it got sort of handed off to Alex Miller. Really, Alex Miller drove this whole thing with some basic high-level guidance from Rich Hickey, and it's awesome. You know, Alex made something that's very, very, very simple. It only does one thing, and there's no way it's ever going to do more, right? Because we know what happens when you do more stuff. Deps is only going to ever manage your dependencies. It's never going to do other stuff. And then your question should be, well, how are you going to do the other stuff? Okay, it's cool that it manages my deps, but how can I do the other useful operations that I like from Leiningen or boot? And there's a great answer for this. And I'll show you this. So I did this with Clojure Script. Make a freaking library, make a function, and then that function can be invoked from the command line, right? When I look at what people are doing with Leiningen, what are you doing? Line CLI build once, prod, right? That's what you're doing. Everything is always driven from the command line, right? But the person that wrote the plugin is tapped into the complexity of the plugin framework. Whereas what I'm suggesting is dump the plugin framework, write a friggin' library, expose a function, and then we can just call it. And I'm going to demonstrate how Clojure Script now follows that very simple principle. But before we get into it, I want to show you something cool, which you can go try. If you haven't tried the CLI stuff, I'm going to show you something that you should want to try right now, because it's way better than what you've probably been doing before. So I'm going to show you my global deps Eden file, which allows you to set up really nice tooling. In this case, I'm only using it for one thing, which is sorry, I messed this one up. This slide, I should have highlighted. Sorry, let me just fix this. Not this one. This one. Sorry about that. So Bruce Howman, who created something called Figwheel, he made this new thing called Rebel Readline. And so this demonstrates I can have, like, I want, when I'm just doing stuff, I want a really nice REPL that I can access all the time. So the other thing that Dep CLI does is allows you to set up aliases, and it's really great. I can set up an alias so that when I define the alias, it augments the class path and it passes some methods to Clojure before it launches Clojure. Because Clojure is always, since day one, it's always taken command line arguments. You could always invoke a function or run a file with Clojure. And it's not slow, but people have been used to going through the Leiningen hoop to do this. That's why it seems slow. But Clojure has always had this capability. So all you do is it augments the class path, and then it passes some predefined command line arguments saying, Clojure, find the namespace with this method and launch it. And what am I going to get here? So up here, I'm going to go CLJ-A rebel. Like this, that's the alias I had in my file. It's giving it away. All right. Well, whatever. You'll see it. Okay. So I have what looks like a REPL. But this is a superpowered REPL. I can go REPL help. I can scroll up. And then I have a bunch of key bindings. I have a bunch of commands. But if I start typing FI, I can press tab, and I might get a propos. I can tab through it. I can go Control X, Control D to get docs. Control X, Control S to get source. I can make write a function here. It uses par infer to automatically indent your source. Right, and all this stuff works. I can go back and it does the correct thing. So this is the REPL that you always wanted, and I had to write 2 lines of stuff in my deps Eden. And Rebel Readline is just a library. It's not designed for boot. It's not designed for Leiningen, but it's as powerful as any REPL you can get with those tools. Right? It's just a library. So let's take that to its logical conclusion. So I saw that and I was like, whoa, that's really awesome. We should do that in Clojure Script. So that was the demo. So most people here probably, if you're using Clojure Script, you use Line CLJS build, which again, Line CLJS build kind of sits in the same place as Leiningen. You know, in the early days, using Clojure Script was like really hard. It was really, really hard. And the community around Clojure Script didn't take off until Line CLJS build appeared. Line CLJS build gave people a way through a standard tool, line again, another standard tool to build their Clojure Script. So they didn't have to go read all this crazy stuff about the compiler. So again, Line CLJS build served this purpose of building a nice community around Clojure Script. But I was sitting there thinking, like, what if I exposed pretty much everything Line CLJS build does, but again, as a function? And so I did this. So some of you may have seen this talk, but I'm not going to assume that you have. I wrote a thing called CLJS main, which is a function inside of Clojure Script, which you can invoke, and it takes all the arguments that Clojure takes. So Clojure takes things like -e to eval, -i to run an init script. You can pass a script directly to execute it. All this stuff just works. And of course, I've extended it so that you can compile files, you can set up watchers. All the typical operations are available through a function. And again, it's not tied to anything. And in fact, you can invoke this via line again or boot. There's nothing about making a simple library that precludes using it with some other plugin system. So if you take away anything, if you're going to build tools as simple libraries, and then if you want to do the integration, do it as a separate step. If you want to integrate with line again or boot. So the truth is Clojure Script was always just a Clojure library. It was just hard to use. It didn't present a nice interface. So the very first thing I did was I finally exposed a very nice command line interface, again, modeled completely after Clojure. And that's important because what happens is that you remove all the differences, you keep it simple. So let me show a demo of this down here. I'm going to close this. Oops. So actually, let me go back to this directory. So in the same way, I have an alias for Clojure Script, so I can do all this stuff without doing the boring parts of the command line. And this is enough to say I want the output directory to be this current directory, and I want to launch a REPL. And the only one that's different here is D for setting the output directory, because Clojure doesn't do that. But everything else is actually the same as Clojure. CLJ, like if I go CLJ-R, that's pretty sure that should work. Yeah. Yeah. So that launches a browser, and I have a browser connected REPL, right? Like this. But other things, interesting things work. I can go -e, and I can pass a form to evaluate. And that just works, right? So a lot of these differences that, again, are just artifacts of history because you didn't have time to work on it, they're gone. And what I'm trying to demonstrate is Clojure Script now is fully functional from the command line. You can pass, you can go like this. So you're probably wondering, like, what options does it support? You can go -h just like Clojure, and you're going to get a huge list of things. You can launch the simple built-in web server. You can do a REPL. You can launch Node REPLs. You can launch Nashorn REPLs, Rhino REPLs. You can compile a namespace. You can specify the optimization level. You can watch a path. You can also provide here down with compile. You can provide you can provide compile options as Eden. So so a lot of people were like, well, how can I do what I was doing with build profiles? And actually, build profiles are really annoying because actually merging them is really, really obnoxious. I don't know if you've experienced this, but the way that Clojure Script works is that it emulates Clojure, and that what happens is that if you pass the same flag multiple times, it's going to merge them. So for example, you can pass compile ops multiple times. You can have a base build description, and then you can have prod, which just merges with the base description, right? And you can do this with aliases. So I could go like this. I want to compile, base plus prod, and it'd say, app.core, right? I don't need profiles. So aliases give me all the functionality I need to augment the argument list, right? So all these things can be collected. So even though I showed you doing in the global deps Eden, there's no reason to do that, right? You can build a project with deps Eden, and you can have project local aliases that describe all the things you would have typically done with your profile. But in this case, it's much simpler. You don't need to talk about profiles. You have composition and merging just by the nature of how tools deps works. So back to the slides. So the huge thing here, so how does this impact? So, you're probably thinking like, well, why did, in some sense, it's not like this is an advancement in the sense of like, it's something completely new. It's something that you had before, but it just does it in a simpler way. But there's a caveat, which is that since CLJ only does one thing, and everything that I showed you was like trivial declarative changes to my deps Eden file. Because it does one thing, this is a massive game changer with respect to reproducibility. As the maintainer of Clojure Script, one of the hardest things that I encounter is that somebody says X doesn't work. And I'm like, well, can you show me a minimal case? And then they have to go dissect all their profiles, all their plugins, all this stuff, and somehow come up with something small enough that I can make it work. And then on top of that, even if I do get that thing, I often run into a case where, why doesn't it work on my machine? Why can't I see the bug on my machine? And it's just a side effect of the tooling being complicated because the tooling does too much. So it's been huge. So for me as a maintainer and for the end user as a reporter, if you do it via deps Eden, the amount of work I have to do to find your bug, it's massively decreased. People can literally write bug reports in a tweet, right? Or in a one-liner. This has already happened. People say, check out this SHA of Clojure Script, pass this little trivial program, and it works. In fact, because you can curl a gist and just run it as a command line thing. It's pretty cool. Huge for reproducibility. Again, it's because tools deps dependencies only, fewer moving parts. The other game changer here is Git-based dependencies. So people always say there's a bug, right? That's just found something, it doesn't work. And then I'm like, did you try master? And then I have to explain to them, as if they were a compiler developer, how to friggin' build Clojure Script from source, right? It doesn't make any sense. This is not something anybody should have to do as an end user. But because tools deps allows you to point at a Git repo and provide a SHA, that's all it needs. And it will do all the transitive dependencies via any deps Eden files that exist in those Git deps. I can just say, just drop this into your deps Eden and make a minimal case. And they can just hand that to me, and I know there's very few moving parts, and I can check that it does or does not work with that commit. It's huge. Again, bug reports have already been delivered this way, and it's a huge time saver. So again, time saver for both the person that's reporting the bug and a huge time saver for people that are working on fixing the bugs. So if you're going to try something new, like if you're going to do a little pet toy project, I highly recommend trying it. In fact, and let me just launch this, and while we wait for that, I'll keep going. Yeah, so it looks like this. So what does that look like? So here, instead of having a Maven, coordinates, I can provide a Git URL. I just point to GitHub, and I provide the SHA. And this just works, and I'll show you that down here in a second. So here, but let's wait for this, just so you can see what I want to, this other thing I want to show. Why are you doing that? So here, no, I want this. I want that. So here, I just want to show you that it's really not an either or thing. So if you look here, I know the type's a bit small, but in Clojure Script itself, we have the project file, but now we also have, where is it? The deps Eden file. Right. So again, that's another thing. There's been client projects where the build's gotten so complicated. I've suggested for reproducing issues, you can just set a deps Eden file that mimics the project file, just so that we have less inner moving parts. So again, I do a bunch of testing now with deps Eden. So it's not like an either or thing. What's great about this stuff is that it's a la carte, right? You can do both, and I think that you would find that it's still useful. But over here in this other window, I have just a demo to show you that this does actually work. If I go here to some bug that somebody reported, like an npm scope dependency bug, I have a thing here, which is this specific checkout of Clojure Script. And I can just run the commands I was running before. Hopefully this works. It might not work. I've never tried it. Wait, whoops. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, oh, yeah, sorry. So this is why I use the alias, because I don't have to type in -m cljs main. This is not going to be quite as fast as the other way I did it, because I don't know. So another thing that's changed is that a lot of people, that's just behind the scenes, is Clojure Script is now AOT compiled, meaning the dependency we ship there's no sources there, but you're running ahead of time compiled Clojure code, and this is taking longer because Clojure Script is now like, I don't know, it's almost 20,000 lines of Clojure, and it actually takes a while, especially on a slow old laptop. There we go. And if I type to show you that this actually is the right thing, oh, maybe it didn't work, and I'm probably going to move on if it didn't work. I didn't try this. Huh. Well, the code ran, but does that... I'm going to move on because, again, I didn't try this. But anyways, it should work. Sorry. But the point of the talk is tools should be simple libraries. Again, it's not like I'm not saying don't stop using Line and boot. That doesn't make any sense. You already have code that works, applications that you're shipping, right? You've already invested in that stuff. But all I'm suggesting is if you're going to build a library, do the interface as a second step. One library that really did this, and it was on accident, is actually Figwheel. So Figwheel was always a Line and plugin, but Figwheel always had this thing called Sidecar. So when I found out that Figwheel worked as a regular library, I actually haven't used Figwheel as a plugin in like 3 years. I always use Sidecar because I can launch everything that Figwheel does as a Clojure program directly. And that was smart. It was a sort of a happy accident that Bruce had thought the problem through and said, oh, there's a part of Figwheel that's generic. I'm just going to expose it as a generic thing, and that's great. And again, the message I'm trying to communicate here is that it actually is better for experts and newcomers. So my experience so far has been that it doesn't really matter if it's people that have been doing Clojure Script for a long time or people that are just starting out. People that are just starting out love this because they don't have to read that much to get started. People who have been doing it for a long time are like, oh, it is actually a bit simpler, and there's an incremental path for me to buy into it, which is, again, that's really important because you have working stuff. So that wasn't too long of a talk, and I'm sure you have lots of questions, so I'm going to open it up and finish there. Questions? So I mean, I'm surprised that Cursive doesn't already have it, to be honest. Oh, sorry. The question was, have you heard from the Cursive developers or the Emacs developers when they'll have support? I thought that Emacs already has support. I saw Bozidor Batsov say something about this. So there is support, I thought, because I do follow both those projects. Cursive, I know, doesn't have it, but Cursive has a workaround because deps Eden is inert, right? It doesn't do anything. You can generate a POM. So here, SPOM, you know. I think hopefully that dumps. It might not work because, yeah, it skips that one. But yeah, so all the things I define are there, right? The unshaded, because I was debugging something for somebody. So the only Maven coordinate was the Clojure compiler unshaded. Does that answer your question? So you can always generate the POM, and that's what Cursive knows via, you know, IntelliJ. Other questions? So that's it. Shadow is really cool. And the main, like, you know, the main reason to use it is because there are some people, especially people that are coming directly from JavaScript, where they want to use, they're not that familiar with the Clojure Script ecosystem, or Google Clojure Library or whatever. They want to use something from NPM, and Shadow Build currently has just a better story because all it does is it just defers to the Webpack, like the Node.js tooling to build the JavaScript stuff, and then it combines that into a build with the Clojure Script compiler. There's some small things I don't like about it, like the fact that it requires Node, which I think is a bit of a strange expectation for a lot of Clojure developers because they don't really care. Node is cool as a thing behind the scenes, but they don't really care about it. But so Shadow is designed to be, I think, a more welcoming tool for JavaScript people or for people that are like, I just want a simpler build flow because I want to use a ton of node deps. And that just depends on your project. At Cognitect, it's just, you know, we just like, I mean, part of the reason that we haven't done that much is that we haven't worked that much on ourselves on projects that need tons of node deps. We're not afraid to build. If somebody built like a dropdown or like a date picker, like we can write that ourselves. It's not a big deal. So we haven't spent that much effort, though. I'm of course I'm following it, and so I'm very interested in improving the NPM dep stuff so that at least more works. And if you are interested in stuff that's happening in the Clojure community, I really recommend sending some dollars to Clojurists Together. Raise your hand if you've heard about Clojurists Together. Okay, cool. So one thing is that like I'm just one person, and I help drive the project, but to be honest, some problems are like CLJS main, even though it seems like, you know, oh, that's cool. It should have probably already worked that way. Just making all the CLJS main stuff more or less work. And of course, there's still small bugs to fix, but that was 2 months of work to make CLJS main work. All the various things, launching the browser, combining the options, making sure all the different ways that you might want to build your project that it's covered. That's like 2 months of effort and like a serious effort. So I'm the only person that, you know, gets open source time to do that at Cognitect. So it's really important that the community also have a sustainable way to do that sort of like non-trivial ticket. So Mike Fikes is personally making it his mission to tackle the NPM dep stuff. And so he's actually using Clojurists Together funding, right? He's requesting it to enhance NPM dep. So I'm hoping maybe in like 6 months or something like this, maybe a little bit longer, that we would at least for things that I see as being like really important, being like things like React or things like Material, basically things that people are like constantly asking for. We want that stuff to work with NPM deps. It may always be outside of our goal to make the library du jour work because that's just kind of like that's like really hard. Who here does serious node development? So not too many. So you know, the problem with the JavaScript world, I think, as many people are aware, is that it changes very quickly, and there are almost no standards around the tooling. So every day, somebody wants to do something different in a different way. It's compounded by the fact that, like, you know, are you doing ES6 with JSX with type declarations, and then you've added this other thing that's like an experimental ES7 feature, right? That's they think this is okay. That's normal. And that's actually really, of course, going to be challenging for handle because that gets pushed downstream onto us as like, should we support that? I think the answer is just going to be no. And if you want that sort of thing, I think there is room for tooling like Shadow CLJS where that's what you want to do. Shadow CLJS can fit that audience. So the other thing that's really nice is the other reason I think you should try this at home, is because it'll shock you. So it used to be like, oh, it's a lot of work to build tools or to write a line again plugin. It's not. It's like, it's not that hard once you understand how line again works. But actually understanding how line again works is really hard. It's hard for me, and I've been doing this stuff for a long time. But within 1 week, Luke Vanderhart wrote a 200-line thing that lets you run tests via command lines in a function call. So now it's ready to go with CLJ. An open source person doing Clojure Script wrote a 200-line program to run tests via the command line for Clojure Script. So these two things that people just like associate with line again and profiles now can be completely driven as they're just libraries that somebody coded up. That I think is really the freedom that CLI and deps gives you, is that like you can make a build tool, a function in your own project. And this is not rocket science. This is an awesome question. So, oh, you want to dynamically do it? I see. So no, you can't do this. So that's it's like a little bit of a convenience where you kind of want to use a function to pass the ops to line again. Is that what you're saying? You could, but you are swimming a bit of, I would say, I understand your question. So the question is, so you might be like, you're doing something fancy. You might know a lot about how line again works. And then you're like, I want to do this specific thing where I write a function to pass the ops. So again, I would say that that is kind of and this is in a different direction than how Depseed works, but let's just look. So up here you have all these things I didn't talk about. -J for Java ops, -O for option aliases, so on and so forth. The thing I would say is that maybe it's cool that you can do your functions, and that sounds cool, but something that I think that's really powerful about Alex's idea about the aliases is that you can build alias sets. And then once you start combining them, it's really, you're like, oh, I can really be like, I want this, I want this, I want this. Something that's really hard to do with line again profiles, right? Line again is more like, I'm going to concatenate these things, and what am I going to get? Whereas with Depseed, you can be like, there's a specific set of options I want. I can be like, I want to change the JVM ops and the GC setting only with this particular test type run, right? These are all things that would just be like, you go -A, low mem, GC ops, test, because maybe somebody to find a bug. And so, yeah, sure, it's cool that you can do it with the function, but I actually think if you try out Alex's approach, I think it's surprisingly expressive and easy to understand. So this is a question where I'd be like, now you're just past like what it definitely seems not like what Alex would want you to do, but there may be a way to do it, and I don't know how. Because remember, tools deps itself is just a library, right? So it is just a library. So there may be a way to, you launch your thing and you just call tools deps to do the thing you want. And I from what I understand, that's definitely a power use case that's there. That's just not going to be something that's like the standard way. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the aliases, with aliases, you can define main ops, which are just command line options. You can define local dependencies, like how you want to extend the class path. But what's really cool is you can say this class path augmentation uses a local project, or it uses a Git dep. So there's all these sort of combinations where, like, if you ask me to figure out how to do the line again or boot, I'd be like, that just sounds like a day's worth of time. Whereas here, because we treat the command line as a universal interface to this stuff, it really just removes a surprising number of obstacles, conceptual obstacles. It does, but I believe that you should look. I mean, there's all these sort of tips. Fortunately, I'm advertising this technology, and it's been about 5 months, I think, now. Yeah, almost 5 months it's been out. So people have the exact same question. I believe there's a way to generate Depseed from your project.clj. Right. So I would say we don't really have a vision here because you have to be realistic, right? I mean, Clojure's 10 years old, right? And so, there are projects out there with like 200,000 lines of Clojure, right? And come on, you're not gonna mess around that much with that project. There may be some subsystem where you play around with the thing, but you're not going to change the big thing. So this is definitely something to try to assess yourself. Take what I've said and say, confirm for yourself. Does this seem simpler? And then say, is there a place in my project where this would alleviate something? Whether that you start with testing, whether you start with bug reports or whatever, I don't know. I don't know the details. But I would suggest start incremental. And then I would argue that it's kind of up to the community how much interop you really want. At Cognitech, we have the same problem. That's what I'm trying to say. We can't have a vision because our clients use some random set of things that are available in the community, and we are not in control of that. Occasionally, we have greenfield projects, and we can start with Depseed, right? And that's what we do. And from my perspective, all I'm getting really is, remember, my philosophy was that Maven plus Bash. So this is just a Maven plus Bash that doesn't suck. That's all this really is. Git dependencies, which is huge. It's huge. You had a question? Another question? I thought I saw a hand. No? I mean, the thing that really sells people on Clojure Script, I would say, like, of course, I work on Ohm, but Ohm was kind of like an experiment, especially Ohm Next was kind of an experiment to be like, okay, this is React, GraphQL, Relay. Let's see if we can do a version of that that's Clojure-y. But I've actually spent a year on a project now with Reagent, actually. And Reagent, I would say if nobody's ever used Clojure Script for UI work, just using Reagent plus Figwheel, and you've never seen anything like that, that alone is a game changer. People are blown away. So I worked on a project where almost every UI dev that I was working with had started doing UI development for like 3 months. And there's of course there's things that they're still learning about Clojure, but the short cycle of I change the file, it hot reloads, I test the thing. Once you've seen that, you don't really want to go back. And that, I think, it's still true that it works better in Clojure Script than it does in JavaScript, just because of the way that JavaScript works. People don't write you can't force people to write immutable UIs. You can't really force people to make their hot code their code hot reloadable. But it just works in Clojure because everybody writes functions, everybody uses persistent data structures. Hot code reloading is not hard. It's just not hard. And when you see what you get when it's not hard, I think that's still ahead of the game. I think, I mean, sadly, I don't think I saved this gist, but I literally think what I did was I made an alias for Sidecar. I invoked Sidecar, and that was it. And then so I would have a project with my deps Eden, and they'd have a alias for Sidecar. No. So the thing is, I don't use NRepla, but it's okay because when I use Emacs, I use inf Clojure. When I'm in cursive, there's a Clojure main mode, which is like inferior Lisp. So because if I can invoke it on the command line, I can get the Lisp REPL integration. So that's what I do. As long as I can invoke something on the command line, I can get the REPL that I want. That make sense? Yeah. But good question. So that is a good question. I mean, since I can't answer too many questions about what this means for NRepla because I'm not a big user of NRepla. And I know if you're doing Emacs, you're definitely using NRepla for sure, but I can't speak too much on it. I will say that my impression is that there is enough enthusiasm among the tooling authors to support deps Eden. So I would be surprised if the low-hanging fruit like this isn't solved quickly. Okay, great. Yeah, but so people are moving pretty fast. I was actually surprised how quickly people picked it up. Yeah. Well, the answer is Mike Fikes. Mike Fikes is a bit of a wizard. He's become a bit of a wizard. I think he showed a gist where he checks out Clojure Script from master, self-compiles it, loads the deps Eden, and then runs something. Yeah, I thought I saw him do something like this, where it was like this crazy, like calling, and then you end up with a self-hosted runtime that also uses deps Eden. Yeah. Okay, I think I've taken up enough of your time. I'm assuming people can hang out for a little bit, and if you want to, thanks. If you want to ask me any more questions, come say hello. Thanks.